At least 22 innocent people were murdered by a suicide bomber in Manchester, England. Unfortunately, our leaders are going to tell us that acts of terror are just something that happens, like the weather. Just accept it and move on. There is nothing you can do, or better yet, just pretend it's not happening all around you. As Katie Kay, the BBC, put it this morning, Europe is, quote, getting used to attacks like this because they have to, because they're never going to be able to totally wipe this out.
There's this meme going around that this is the new normal, that we must just come to terms with this and that we must carry on as normal, act calm, behave calm and stand united. And that's all well and good. But, you know, what kind of world is it in which I have to accept that the slaughter of my children, of youth in a concert is normal and that's just nothing I can do about it? What kind of world do we want to live in where we just accept that as a status quo? In any other world, that would be called apathy and appeasement.
Why is violent terrorism an inevitability in Europe now? Unless you grew up in Northern Ireland or Italy or the Basque Country, terrorism was not a significant hazard a generation or two ago. Ask someone who was alive then. This is new. Something has changed. What is it? Well, the answer, as most people understand, but relatively few admit, is that demographics change. There are a lot of Muslims living in Europe now. Most of them are indeed decent people, as we're often assured, but a surprisingly large number of them aren't. Check the numbers. In 2006, after just a year after terrorists murdered more than 50 people in London on the subway bombings, a full 20% of British Muslims said they sympathized with the motives of the bombers. Younger Muslims were even more enthusiastic about what had happened, about the killings. In 2007, Pew found that at least 20% of young Muslims here in America, in France, Germany, and Britain and Spain, believed that suicide bombings could be justified. In France, that number was above 40%. Last year, 29% of French Muslims said they viewed Sharia as a higher law than the civil laws of France. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised that radical views are common among Western Muslims because they're even more common in their home nations. In 2014, 47% of Bangladeshi Muslims said suicide bombings to defend Islam were acceptable, almost half. A quarter of Egyptians said the same thing. A fifth of Turks and Malaysians agreed. In 2009, 78% of Pakistani Muslims told Pew that people who leave Islam should be killed, murder for apostasy. In Egypt, support for that was 86%, Afghanistan 79%, Bangladesh 44%, Iraq 42%. Well, these are not little places, obscure theocracies in remote regions. They're some of the biggest countries in the Muslim world, and more to the point, they've sent millions of immigrants to the West. We could go on like this for the whole show. There's an awful lot of research on this subject, and all the numbers tell the same story. Why are they being ignored? Now, our leaders like to boast they believe in science, that they let data and hard evidence drive their policies. They are lying, and never more obviously than in this case. They don't want to see the numbers. They actively suppress them. If you really cared about America, you wouldn't want it to become Europe, dangerous, divided, unstable. You wouldn't import a massive Muslim minority into your country simply because it made you feel open-minded and virtuous, and then hope for the best. That's a faith-based approach, and it's nuts. We know exactly what will happen if we do that because we're watching it live on television from Manchester right now. If you really cared about the country you led, you'd figure out how to make sure that every person you imported, of any religion, enthusiastically shared your most cherished values: tolerance, pluralism, free speech, equality under the law, just for starters. You tell them not to litter, by the way, when they're here, too. We do the opposite. Our leaders worship multiculturalism, so we encourage immigrants to reject our culture in favor of their own because all cultures are equal, except that they're not all equal, as we were reminded last night with the murder of children in an arena in Manchester. Defend what you believe or you will lose it. That's the message of Manchester, just as it is also the basic lesson of all of history. But what if you don't believe in anything at all? Our leaders don't. Maybe that's why they can't defend us.
The Greater Manchester head of police came out this evening and said, you know, we will not tolerate hate against the Muslim community. And for so many of us, we're kind of saying, well, it's OK, then we will tolerate our little girl, 8-year-old girls being slaughtered as they leave a concert, but we won't tolerate hate speech. That seems to be where we're at in the UK tonight.
Well, the primary aim of any government should be to protect its citizens and the integrity of the nation. I'm afraid this country is so hidebound by political correctness that we have allowed the mass sexual rape and abuse of thousands of underage girls in northern cities, and we've done nothing about it. We've allowed people to go and be deeply radicalized, even brutalized in Syria, and done nothing about it.
If I was living during the US civil rights crisis, back in the days when segregation was still rife, you would call me an apologist if I didn't get involved to fight segregation, racial segregation. You don't have to be Muslim to challenge this extremism. Muslims and non-Muslims all have to stand together to challenge Islamist theocratic extremism, just as we're responsible to challenge racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism and other ills in society. So this is a full-on civil society campaign to reassert and protect our liberal values against these theocratic values, and that genuinely requires action from government, but more importantly from communities.
We have a large number of youth that are being radicalized. This happens because of the books that we have, the Islamic scriptures that we have. They push the Muslim youth to believe that if you go out there and you kill the infidel, that's how you will gain paradise.
I don't know where the Imam got his information from. First of all, these scriptures existed for hundreds of years. They didn't incite for violence or terror act. It is an ideology of the so-called Islamic State.
I disagree. We have a situation where there is a month doesn't go by without a terrorist attack happening somewhere around the world. And for the past 1,400 years, we have had a religion of war. That's exactly what we have had. This is not something I'm imagining. These are facts. We've had many wars. How did Islam spread from Saudi Arabia down to Indonesia and Bosnia? All spread by the sword. We had many wars. And for someone to come and say these Islamic scriptures have nothing to do with it, I mean, that's against the facts.
A new report released by the British government concludes there are about 3,500 people being watched as potential terrorists. Not a big country. At least 400 people who have returned to Britain after leaving to fight for ISIS, the very group that took responsibility for the Manchester bombing. So maybe there's lessons here, patterns that lawmakers need to consider as they respond, or we could go with the traditional choice, the one favored by our leaders, which is to add British flags to our Facebook profiles, pretend that terrorism somehow brings us together rather than drives us apart, and dismisses anyone who asks real questions as a bigot and a nativist, so we can maintain the illusion that terror bombings are just an unavoidable fact of life in the big city.
For the last few years, I've said that either we take away the passports of people we suspect of being linked to ISIS and stop them going, or perhaps better still, when they've been to Syria, on their attempt to return, we take their passports away and stop them coming back in. And the remarkable thing is that we know of 400 that have been to fight in Syria that have returned, though we suspect the number may be 1,000 or more, and yet we've only taken action against 40. It is, and I'm frankly sick to death of seeing prime ministers and leaders standing up after attacks, saying how awfully sorry we are for everything, when nothing is being done to counter the bad guys.
Nigel will know this better than I do, but for purposes of comparison, at the height of the IRA's campaign, MI5 estimated that there were no more than 100 active operatives, and that involved just basically going 20 miles down the road. These guys travelled halfway round the planet to fight for the Queen's enemies. That's the definition of treason. I don't know why they're walking around on the street. We're told that it would be very expensive to throw 850 people into prison. Germany estimates that for every one of these suspects they're tracking, they need 60 people tracking that guy. So it's a lot cheaper to toss them into prison for going off and fighting for your enemies abroad than it is to have 60 people monitoring them and then doing nothing until 48 hours after they've blown up a bunch of people.
Research found that up to 80% of jihadist attacks and the attackers are connected to networks, ideologies, groups and others who knew of their radicalization. They are almost never alone. But this myth of the fact that they are lone actors serves three purposes mainly. One is it allows security services, when they commit mistakes and oversights, to say there was nothing we could do about it anyway because they were lone actors. We couldn't have stopped them nor predicted them. It allows politicians, number two, to say there's nothing we can do about it and thereby retreat to a politically correct standard. And third, it allows, most importantly, our communities to shirk responsibility, because, of course, the truth is we're in the midst in Europe of a jihadist insurgency where people who are like me and others and live among us have become radicalized, and it wasn't ISIS that radicalized them. Right. ISIS plucked the low-hanging fruit. They've been radicalized for decades because of this ideology that's been spreading in our communities.
As disgusting as what happened on Monday night was, equally concerning is the reaction of people like the Deputy Mayor and the Prime Minister and the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, who are basically asking the citizens of the United Kingdom to live with the official lie, where nothing can be said that is actually approximates to the reality of the situation here. That's Soviet and totalitarian. They basically said, this is an official lie. You know it's absurd. You know it doesn't match what you see, but this is it, and you have to accept it.
Well, the media hardly acquitted themselves well with their coverage. Fox began covering the attack at 6:48 p.m. Eastern. The other two cable networks, not so much. At 7, we began covering Manchester exclusively. The other networks still leading with Russia. Chris Matthews even moved back to Russia, where you could hear people screaming in the background. Surely after a half hour, things had changed. Wrong. At 7:30, you guessed it, still on Russia. At 7:36, they still weren't covering Manchester like it was a gruesome attack. We knew it was by then, but you wouldn't know it by watching those channels. When the other media did start covering it, things weren't necessarily better.
It must also be noted that in recent months in Europe, there have been a number of false flag plots where right-wing extremists have tried to frame Islamists for terrorism.
We could have people injured in an accidental explosion, some kind of event in there with equipment, loud noise. Sometimes these concerts use fireworks, so there's reports that there's large gas-filled balloons there. The deaths could be from stampede.
And we should be clear that numerous violent attacks that have happened in Europe have been French citizens, British citizens, and in fact there was one example in Germany of essentially a framing of ISIS at an attack on a soccer bus by essentially a right-wing neo-Nazi. This has also happened in Europe in the last several months. So we should just be careful about attribution.
There are some numbers around this that are just stunning. 105 minutes during the 7 p.m. hour, this is according to an MRC study, was spent on Trump in Russia on CNN and MSNBC. Just 50 minutes on an attack, grotesque, as you says, in the city of a Western ally where women and children, young girls going to a concert are killed. Any community access producer or manager would know in that situation that once this story broke at 6:48, it is full stop. There is no other story to cover. But this just shows you that it's media malfeasance marinated in myopia. Alliteration aside, this is what happens now when you're so locked into one story that you miss a story like this where everything should have gone away and this should have been the only thing that was covered.
Look, I mean, you know exactly. I've been doing this a long time. You've been covering it a long time. You know exactly what happened. Their formula is working. Their viewers think that Donald Trump is a marionette controlled by Vladimir Putin. They think this because they're being told it by the anchors over there who are spinning these incredibly complex and insane conspiracy theories. And they're getting good numbers by doing that. And so they don't even a terror attack won't get them off it because they're completely addicted to the drug of ratings. I mean, that's what it is.
It's not only what journalism looks like in 2017, Tucker, it's what it sounds like, and more importantly, it's what it smells like, and it sticks to your boots.